Moments ago, Todd Blanche was greeted by DOJ staffers shortly after he was sworn in as Attorney General. There he is getting out of his SUV. And those are the cheers among DOJ staffers at the DOJ building in Washington, D.C. You can see some handshakes as well. He was sworn in by another former Trump attorney and current sitting judge, Emil Bove. Last night, Donald Trump boosted yet another former personal attorney. Trump announced that White House Staff Secretary Will Scharf will lead the Office of Legal Counsel. You may recognize Scharf because he's the guy who's read Donald Trump's executive orders to the press. Here he is right here, all the way on the left. As White House counsel, Scharf, who previously worked in a private capacity on the E. Jean Carroll case, the Supreme Court presidential immunity arguments, and the commission overseeing Trump's D.C. projects, he will advise now the president and the White House on legal and policy questions related to the office of the presidency. Months ahead of the midterm elections, critics are openly wondering what Scharf might have in store. Joining us, MS Now senior White House reporter Vaughn Hilliard, senior legal reporter Lisa Rubin, Alex Wagner still with us. Vaughn, give us a little bit more on Will Scharf.
Will Scharf is the guy that America became familiar with here when he was the one that would read the executive orders or executive actions that he would then hand over to the president to sign over the course of the last year and a half. But he was somebody who was even more importantly outside of this role, in which effectively he would, as staff secretary, pass documentation and pass records and briefings. He was sort of the filter between everything else in the White House and what ultimately made its way onto the desk and hands of the president. But if you go back to 2023, 2024, he was a part of the legal team that was constructed to defend Donald Trump on a multitude of fronts. And one of those was preparing arguments for the Supreme Court as it pertained to the broad immunity claims that the president sought to take to the court and justify for charges related to the election interference indictment to be dropped. And so Will Scharf is, on one hand, very much an ally of the president and his own legal team and legal philosophy and broad reach of the executive office, but somebody who the president has also grown to trust. We should be clear, too, that Dave Warrington was somebody who was serving as the chief counsel, the general counsel in this White House, and somebody who was trusted as a veteran legal hand for the president and his team. But now he's turning to somebody who is younger, yet knowingly somebody who will seek to make the arguments that the president has been very clear that he wants individuals who are a part of his legal apparatus to be able to make not only in filings, but also in court.
Lisa?
Well, one of the things that strikes me about Will Scharf is his role as the White House staff secretary, as Vaughn was just mentioning, but not literally what he's doing as staff secretary, but the ways in which he's gone outside the role. So Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan had some reporting last month for the New York Times in which they discussed the fact that Will Scharf is really the thing that stood between Stephen Miller suspending habeas corpus and the president thinking that that was a good idea. They noted that Will Scharf was someone most of us had never heard of, that he is an unassuming presence. And yet he wrote a very forceful memo to Susie Wiles, apparently at her behest, explaining why constitutionally, Katie, that was a poor idea. That's not usually the role of the White House staff secretary. In fact, that's the kind of memo you would expect to come from the Office of Legal Counsel or the White House counsel. The fact that it comes from Will Scharf indicates that while he is a reliable ally for the president, he's also a person that others can use sometimes as like the imprimatur of what the law actually says and prevents.
So what do you think he might do? Or can we say that in the event that Donald Trump wants to deny the results of the 2026 November midterm elections, that Will Scharf might be the guy standing in the breach, given what you just mentioned about the last event?
No, I'll never say never, because Will Scharf, as Vaughn was also noting, is part of the architecture of the presidential immunity decision, something that many legal experts and reporters, me included, said would never happen because of the history of United States versus Nixon and also many statutes and the structure of the Constitution. So I don't know what Will Scharf will do, but I think his history and the fact that he's a former federal prosecutor is really interesting at a time where this White House appears to be preparing for a potential changing of the guard in Congress. If that happens and more investigations are headed the White House's way instead of coming out of the White House, the fact that they have a White House counsel incoming who has been a federal prosecutor should tell you something about what they're preparing for and who they want to have on hand.
So, Alex, where do you stand on this?
I mean, it doesn't look good from my vantage point. This is also the guy that helped walk through the Brett Kavanaugh nomination through to confirmation. Also worked on Amy Coney Barrett. Also was a consultant for the Judicial Crisis Network. I mean, there was a lot of scuttlebutt. At the risk of sounding paranoid, and I'll defer to Lisa on this, but at the risk of sounding paranoid, there's been a lot of speculation about whether Alito or Thomas is going to retire for the Supreme Court and what the implications would be if Trump gets another open seat on the bench. This guy has experience getting highly controversial nominees through to confirmation. So, that could be a role for him to play. He also would be in charge of presidential pardons, which Trump has used as like the ultimate honeypot, the ultimate carrot. So, when you have someone who has a proven record of, as you point to the immunity decision, making outlandish claims as far as the law, I don't think it's great that he's going to be overseeing potentially the judicial nominations process and the pardons process in addition to the rest of his portfolio.
We can't overlook, Lisa, how many former defense attorneys Donald Trump's putting in positions of power.
No, in fact, the triumvirate, I would argue to you, of the top legal jobs in America right now are filled by former personal attorneys. Todd Blanche, John Sauer, the Solicitor General, who was Will Scharf's law partner, and Will Scharf himself. Those three top jobs, all filled by former lawyers to the president. And of course, not lost on me is the fact that swearing in Todd Blanche today is yet another.
Mention
Emil Bovee.
Is he the guy, is he somebody we should be looking at as a potential nominee for the Supreme Court?
Are we talking about Emil Bovee or are we talking about Will Scharf? Because Will Scharf is staff secretary. There's some precedent there, too. Guess who the White House staff secretary was during the Bush administration? 37-year-old Brett Kavanaugh, who was then nominated to the D.C. Circuit before he was elevated to the Supreme Court.